today is the second seminar where the title is Witnessing White Academics and Community Members Speak on Militarism in the Philippines, which will start as soon as I'm finished until 2 o'clock. And then tomorrow there will be a debate imperialism, militarism, and the necropolitics of the promise, which starts at 12 to 1:30 at same place. So welcome and enjoy the second series of the symposium. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Joy Barrios, and I'm a lecturer here at the Asian American Studies Department. So let me introduce this panel first by giving you some statistics provided by Karapatan Human Rights Organization in the Philippines. For the first quarter of 2013, there were 19 victims of extrajudicial killings. Not first quarter of 2013, but 2014. From July 20 to December 2013, there were 169 cases of extrajudicial killings, 19 cases of enforced disappearances, 570 cases of illegal arrest and detention, 8,923 cases of firing by the military, and 132,633 cases were in schools, medical, religious, and other public places were used for military purposes. All these because of Oplan Bayanihan, the government's counterinsurgency program. So this panel looks into the ways by which scholars, community members, and writers come together to investigate and articulate the Filipino people's struggle against militarism in the Philippines, both in the homeland and in sites of migration. So we have 3 speakers for today, and our first speaker is Melissa Roxas. Melissa is a poet, health worker, and human rights activist. While conducting health care work in the Philippines on May 19, 2009, she was abducted at gunpoint, held in secret detention in a Philippine military camp, and tortured for 6 days. Refusing to remain silent, Melissa continues to write and speak out against human rights violations and to demand justice for its victims. Melissa Roxas.
I really want to thank Professor Joy Barrios and the department for inviting me here today. And like Joy introduced me, I'm a survivor of torture and abduction by the Philippine military. And it's not easy for me to talk about my experience every time. I think I have it together, and then every time I start talking, it's very emotional. But the reason why I do it is because I think it's such an important, human rights violations is such an important topic, and also militarization right now, especially right now in the Philippines, which I think that other 2 speakers will talk about as well. And the reason why I also speak is because it happens, continuing to happen to other people in the Philippines, mostly activists, people who are defenders of human rights, and also civilians. Whole communities are being militarized. And part of as a poet, health worker, and human rights activist, part of what my passion for my work, what continues my passion for that is really the people I've met and the stories they've shared with me. And for over 18 years, I worked in underserved, oppressed, and exploited communities. And I will read you a part. The first poem I'll read is a part of a poem I wrote that is dedicated to the mother I met during a fact-finding mission I went on in 2005 in Mindoro, Occidental, Philippines. She shared her story about the disappearance of her son, Ding, and the multiple fact-finding missions she went on that finally resulted in the exhumation of his body. This is for Ding's mother, the exhumation of Ding. The rising is always the most difficult part. I never knew the body could bend like that. bloated twice its size except around the wrists where his hands were tied, except around the feet where his feet were bound, except around the mouth where a piece of cloth was tied. I saw the open width of his body, his genitals slashed, cut. I could still see him, that is not him, with the fires of his body put out, buried alive. The green cloth around his mouth would not let the sacred things I poured into it take back the sins of men who are not men. Instead, the blue carvings on his body bore their markings, bore the scent of smoke from the general's cigar. It was my son. What can a mother do? The tears are not enough to bury him, to erase that twisted look on his face, to take back the many breaths, the many words he said to me once, Nanay. It is filled now with dirt and pieces of cloth he tried to chew. I held him. I listened to the hollow tunnels of his body, the cold, filling entrances to mine. This poem is one of many that I had written and forms part of a collection that the Philippine military took from me when I was abducted and tortured. As a volunteer worker, I was conducting health surveys in a little town called La Paz in the province of Tarlac, Philippines, when I was abducted on May 19, 2009. We were taken to the military camp of Fort Magsaysay, Nueva Ecija. It's home of the 7th Infantry Division of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And I was held in secret detention, separated from my companions, and held in solitary confinement and tortured for 6 days. The whole time I was handcuffed and blindfolded, subjected to relentless interrogations and torture. And although I knew that, it was my physical body that the Philippine military held in the torture room, but I knew that what they really wanted to destroy was more than me. They wanted to destroy what I was a part of and what I represented, which was a movement of resistance to oppression and exploitation. And during the torture, one of the ways that I protested the inhumanity of violence was actually through the creation and recitation of poems to myself. The torturers had control of, my body, they had control of my movements, but I knew that one thing that they could never control was my mind. And so as much as I could, I didn't want to relinquish this last freedom, to be able to create, to think. And so as much as I could, I wrote poetry in my head. And the Philippine military would often, when they torture you, they usually take you out of the room when it was still dark, either at night or early morning, to take you out. And the act of waiting to be tortured is probably just as terrifying as the physical torture itself. And the next piece is about that, Come Before the Night Hour, that I had written while I was in the secret detention. Come before the night hour, come sing to yourself. Night comes, Melissa. You are flame to the body, the incipient wing that can't fly. The open skin on a foot bleeds black. Tonight you will learn to die 1,000 times and be resurrected. And poems, they became my meditation, the thing I had to hold on to, a way that I tried to maintain some kind of sanity through the torture. And through poems, I also stayed true to my beliefs, my deeply held convictions, and my commitment and love for the people. I can show you the maps on my body, bruises the torturers left, these scattered brown things in a mouth, thick with layers of tongue, sticky keys, and a hung note, each one a whole country in itself, dark and beloved, with Aita blood, black pore, red pore, black, dark scabs on my knees cracked into a thick brown soup, my nipple a callous flower, all these shiny things of war, sour breath of a dark animal, My brittle bones, my brittle beast, do not weep. And at that time, I really believed that these poems were going to die with me inside the torture room. But I found comfort in creating them anyways because I knew that it was my act of defiance. And the Philippine military I mentioned earlier took years worth of writings when I was abducted and tortured. And writing and literature actually was one of their favorite topics during my interrogation sessions. And they told me not to write any more about human rights and not to write any more about people's stories. So when I surfaced, what I've done is try to reconstruct some of those poems. And because the aim of torture is to destroy, I found that I have to create. And because the aim of torture is to instill fear, I found a way to not be afraid. And because the aim of torture is to silence, I want to continue to speak and to write. Humus. Humus is a brown or black, complex, variable material resulting from partial decomposition of plant or animal matter, and it forms the organic portion of soil. When mixed with other bodies, earth becomes other things, becomes mud with water, becomes food for the seed trying to bloom. It absorbs the sounds and smell of things around it. Plants can grow to know a voice, move with a breath. What then of other things, the things that remain? The plastic wrappers of ramen noodles on the ground, the sardine cans, pieces of rubber from a broken boot, a slipper, a butt of a cigarette with its end still burning. There is odor of musk and wind and rotten calabasa, the movement of men with their hands tied to their backs. What happens to the animal sound from their bodies? The slow grind of breath and bone together, the mouth before the earth in promise of union. What grows from that much soil? The earth grew in Julito's hands. He planted maize and vegetables in the farm. The earth held Renel's feet for hours as he planted squash. The earth has known their names forever, but never like this. You try to rearrange the bones, but the foot doesn't fit the leg. The hip too big for the torso, the neck too dark for the head. One eye is gone, the other is a wrong color. No arm, only two like fists. Mark the parts that still don't have its pieces. Try to fit the ones that are there. Feel the finger, let it point. Lift them all from the fires. Earth, bound by earth, bit, by give, by word, by mouth, by trail, by foot, by squash. Soft the earth unearthed, by rock, by fern, each leaf, each worm, by and by hoe, by pick, bit by bit, we dig. See the sack gray as ash, see red, see blue, hack by hack, you and you, lift with care, lift by might, by red, by rib, by bone, by hair, an eye, my, oh my, they lie. And after surfacing, I spent a lot of time with the families of the desaparecidos, or the disappeared, in the Philippines. And these are families whose loved ones were abducted by the military and still remain missing. And I think that if there was a reason why I lived through this experience, is to tell my story for them, because it's not only my story, but it's a story of many, many other people that still remain missing up until this day. And one of the mothers, whose name is Mrs. Edith Burgos, I wrote this next poem for her. Her son Jonas Burgos, maybe some of you have heard of him, a peasant activist, was abducted by the Philippine military on April 28, 2007, and still remains missing. This is for Tita Edith and all the families of the desaparecidos. Jonas's turtle. Tita Edith told me a story of the turtle she brought home for her sons. A turtle, the only reptile with a suit of armor, bony plates and parts of skeleton on the inside, hard horn structures on the outside. Jonas's turtle was dark green with yellow markings as big as a palm of Jonas's little hand. Tita Edith put Jonas in charge of its care, feeding it, putting it out by the water. Jonas loved that turtle, brought it everywhere. The first turtles lived more than 185 million years ago. One day the turtle disappeared. No one could find it, not in the kitchen, not in the bathroom, not under the pipes or near the drain, not under the beds, not in the dark corners, not in the garden, and not under its favorite leafy plant. Months passed and still no turtle. They thought it was gone. Tita Edith and the family decided to move to another house. When she was packing the last of their clothes in the laundry room, she saw it, a green leg sticking out under a pile of lint. But the turtle was no longer the size of Jonas's little palm. It surfaced 10 times bigger. It was the size of Jonas's small face. Tita Edith smiled when she told me this story, but her eyes looked far away, remembering Jonas as a child, his small hands, his small face, Jonas. She told me to look outside. The turtle was there, and I saw it in the garden. And it was bigger than my 2 hands put together. It seemed happy under the shade, chewing on a green leaf in its turtle nest, turtle home. Then I thought of Jonas. And today, now, the almost 7 years that have passed since his disappearance. Where are you, Jonas? When will you be home? And in terms of the topic of torture and human rights, I don't think that you can really be neutral regarding that subject. Because I think to be neutral is really to be on the side of the oppressor. The reason being that the aim of torture is to silence people, to make them not do anything, to stay inactive, stay passive. That is their aim. And so I really hope that by sharing these stories that you heard today, that you would also take action. Because somewhere, in that dark cell, someone is really being tortured, even as I speak in this room. That's unfortunately a reality in the Philippines and also other parts of the world right now. And what kept my hope alive when I was disappeared was I knew I had the hope that people were still fighting for me, still looking for me. And that's why I'm able to speak in front of you in this room today, is because of that advocacy, because people really advocated for me and kept looking for me. And so I hope that by taking action, you will join that movement for truth and justice. And I thank you today for listening to my story.
So thank you, Melissa, for your powerful poetry and for sharing your experience. Our next, so we offer our condolences to our next speaker, and we thank her for being here today in spite of her recent loss. Her mother just passed away a week ago. So our next speaker is Reverend Jeanelle Abiola. She's the lead pastor of Pine United Methodist Church in San Francisco. She's been active with the Cal Nevada Philippine Solidarity Task Force since 2008, when she took her first pastoral and solidarity visit to the Philippines, and she has been serving as co-chair of the task force since 2011. So here to talk about her experiences when she went to the Philippines on fact-finding missions, let's welcome Reverend Jeanelle Abiola.
Can you see me okay behind this? Yeah? Okay. So I'm a pastor in San Francisco, as Ate Joyce said. But I wanted to talk about the pastoral and solidarity visits. So since 2008, I've been on at least 5, and I'm leading one in July of this coming July. So the purpose of the pastoral and solidarity visits is to respond to the calls of the National Council of Churches of the Philippines. So the National Council of Churches in the Philippines works closely with grassroots community organizations on the ground in the Philippines to address human rights violations and human rights abuses in the Philippines. So the key thing to remember about our work is that it is in response. This is different from some other church mission trips you might have heard of, where folks are like, oh, they need our help, we should just go and build something or do whatever or send money. But our trips are more about a partnership, so that we don't make the calls for what happens on these trips, they lead us. And that's a very important framework to keep in mind. So the way that our task force was created was that in the church, so there's the big United Methodist Church, a resolution was put forth to create a task force to respond to the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. And this resolution was presented and passed in 2006. And then in 2007, the first fact-finding mission trip was conducted, and the delegation was composed of clergy people, so like pastors, bishops, district superintendents, from different parts of the institution, and lay people who were very active in the Methodist Church. And it was led by Bishop Beverly Shamana. She's retired now. So the areas of ministry that our task force focuses on is advocacy and justice in the Philippines, and also doing advocacy work here in the U.S. We also focus on education and awareness building so that we can share the stories that we hear in the Philippines and bring them back. And we also focus on relief. Relief is something that's part of the work, but it's not the end of our work. So that's also a little bit different than what you may see in church mission trips. So aside from going on these trips every year, we also work on building alliances and supporting grassroots community efforts here and there. We utilize the institutional church resources and opportunities for justice and for the people in the Philippines. So churches do have a lot of institutional sway still, right? Like if you're a church and you go to the Philippines and they won't let you somewhere, it just makes them look dumb because they're not letting a church have access, right? The church is very important still in the Philippines. And also here, we also have access to grants and other resources that some organizations don't have access to, so we do our best to try to distribute those resources so that the work can be done effectively and in collaboration. We also have a basketball tournament called Movin' for the Movement, which gets people who are not usually interested in justice work to be involved, because a lot of youth in church do like basketball, and that's a way for them to get through the doors and start being exposed to the work in the Philippines. And recently we've started this thing called Philippine Youth Training, which serves as orientation and information sessions for our pastoral and solidarity visits. We also host speakers, hold events, have report backs, fundraisers, trainings. We're trying to do whatever we can with our capacity. We're all volunteer. So we try to do our best with what we have and with who we know, and that's really helped a lot building with folks. And so, pastoral and solidarity visits. So it's a long title, right? Pastoral and solidarity visit. And for folks who are not familiar with church language, this may be confusing, like what does all of that mean? Basically, pastoral presence is what we call the ministry of presence. What is rare in this world is to actually have people listen to your story. That's across the board. Oftentimes when people talk to folks, they're not listening. They're thinking about the next thing to say, or how to respond, or thinking about their own story, or what they should be doing next, or their to-do list, and things like that. But the ministry of presence is a time when we, as people of faith, center so that we can be one with the person who's speaking. You're just simply letting them speak, trusting their experience, and also doing it from the perspective of compassion. So liberation theology defines compassion as compassion, to suffer with. So when you're practicing compassion, you're actually there to feel the heart of the person who is speaking. And this is all to cultivate a sense of shalom. So in Christian language, shalom, you might have heard it translated as peace, but it's really peace as a result of wholeness. And injustice gets in the way of wholeness. So this way of listening to folks is a way to connect. And when you are in the Philippines listening to people's stories, they're really opening their hearts up to you. They're really opening their hearts up to you, talking about the torture of their loved ones, the abduction of their loved ones, how they miss their loved ones. And on a very human level, that's something that everyone can connect with. We might not all have experienced torture ourselves. We may not know what it is to have somebody, a loved one, abducted or taken away from us, but we do know what it's like to have heartbreak, right? To not be connected with someone anymore, to lose somebody, right? And it's on those heart levels that we can connect with others, and that's what compassion is. And it's through those connections that shalom can happen, that wholeness can manifest itself. One experience that I had in experiencing a sense of shalom was actually when we accompanied Melissa in 2009. So I had been going on these trips, you know, my first trip was the year before in 2008, but 2009 the trip was different because I guess I was in a different place emotionally, but I got to sit next to Melissa on the airplane, and I've been reflecting on this a lot. And I got my Master's of Divinity at Pacific School of Religion, which is like up the hill right there. But what I gain in terms of education and learning on these trips is something that I would never learn in the academic setting. I would never learn from reading. I could only learn it from experiencing. And so with when I was sitting by Melissa, I tell this story a lot, so just so you know. So I was sitting next to her on the plane, and I didn't know what to say. What do you say, right? I didn't know what to say, but I wanted to kind of commend Melissa for having the bravery to go back and having the strength to go back. And her response was like, well, it wouldn't be me if I didn't go back. And to me, that opened up what Jesus' ministry was about. It wasn't about him being superhuman and being a superhero and being extra brave or being extra special, but that he identified with the people so much that their struggle was his struggle, and he was following it till the end. And that's something that you can't have in terms of faith in your head. It's something that you have to feel in your heart and experience in your gut. And so that's kind of been the framework of how I see Jesus from that point on. So the ministry of solidarity is also to see the face of Christ in the other. So seeing the face of Christ in other people, hearing stories from others who are hurting but also rising. And also what we do there is we respond prayerfully. There are some folks who do ask for our prayerful presence while we're there. We also listen to the liberation theology that's being written there in the Philippines, in the Filipino context. It's very different from what you would hear in other places. And we think of ways to act strategically, because all of us have limited resources and we have to do our best to use them the wisest ways possible. Also, what's a little bit different is because National Council of Churches is hosting us, we also, they also set up worship for us. So maybe like at least every other day there's a session of worship, but it's a way to get to that meaning making, that way to deepen the spirit in the justice work, and also a way to be awakened to the situation in the Philippines, not to be guilty about it or hopeless about what's happening, but to kind of get past the ego and feel like you're part of a collective. So So it kind of takes a while to build these delegations to go to the Philippines. But one of the major things that we do is we assess the commitment and the consciousness of folks and the knowledge that people have of the Philippines. And most of the time, we're engaging with folks who know nothing about what's happening in the Philippines. So we have to journey with them on an ongoing basis so that they kind of understand what's happening. We also have the delegates recognize their strengths and their growing points. And we encourage them to use these gifts and their strengths on the visits. We also affirm and assign roles. So like if folks want to be photographing, if folks want to do video, then we encourage that. We encourage folks to take up leadership and to be note takers and interviewers. So when you are sitting with folks who are telling their stories, you have to have these different elements that are part of it so that you can get like the whole perspective of what's happening. So you can record their stories accurately as well. Also, I'm going to be honest, when we bring people to the Philippines, a lot of drama comes up because people's inner stuff comes out. Like feeling so bad that their life is very different than what folks have to experience every day in the Philippines. And sometimes we have to figure out whether we need to deal with that situation there or whether we can wait till we come back here to deal with it. But we're discovering that ongoing relationship with folks in the Philippines and here is really important in helping heal those spaces and helping people journey as they process what they've experienced. When we go to the Philippines, we don't know where we're going until we get there because of security concerns. And then when we do get there, we have a delegation of maybe 10 people, and they split us up into 2 or 3 groups so that we can do community immersions. And we try to have them, try to have the delegation split up across the areas of the Philippines. So this past year in July, we participated in the International Conference for Human Rights and Peace in the Philippines. That was part of our pastoral and solidarity visit. We had a group in southern Luzon, which is the group that I was with, and a group in Sacsargen, which is a combination of a bunch of areas made into one word, in Mindanao. So the reason we do that is so that we can get a broader perspective of what's happening, because it isn't just a situation that's in Mindanao or in this area or that area. It's a national situation. It's systemic oppression, and if it's systemic oppression, it's going to affect every place. So surprisingly, when I was in the Philippines in July and when I was in southern Luzon, we actually visited an area that was militarized by 8 battalions. 8 battalions. Think of 300, at least 300 soldiers per battalion. That's how many people were in this small area in the Philippines. So NCCP, they accompany us on these trips, and they also provide us opportunities to reflect and process. And they also provide us ways that we talk about how we can respond when we come back to the U.S., what the best strategy is for us, what the best relationships for us are to build. And we always get sent to areas that have been militarized within the past month. And in some cases, our community visits have included places that had military presence there while our group was there. And it's very, it's a risk for these groups, for these community folks to open up their homes to us. So we assess whether it's worth the risk or not. So there have been cases where we stay somewhere else, but we visit the community every day, because them even telling their stories becomes a risk on their lives. So I guess one of the main things in terms of doing this work in church is that we're trying to change the perspective that people, specifically church people, have of the poor. In the biblical text, there's always mention of the poor, the oppressed, and the humble, the meek, but there's just one image that we may have of that, and that may be people who are hopeless, disheveled, have nothing. But when you go to the Philippines, you discover that the poor means a number of things. The poor also means the folks rising up, the folks who are empowered, the folks who have more hope than the people that we bring to the Philippines. So if we can accompany people in their suffering, we can also accompany them in their hope. And that's how we can be called to be responsible on these trips and the research, that it's something that we embody in our work. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Jeanelle. So our final speaker for today is Professor Robyn Rodriguez. So her research is broadly concerned with understanding how processes of globalization, particularly international migration, impact the societies that migrants leave and the societies to which they move. She has 2 books, Migrants for Export, How the Philippines Brokers Labor to the World, and Asian America, Sociological and Interdisciplinary Approaches. So she's here today to talk about collaborations between academics and community members. So she works on several projects in the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns. Professor Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. I don't know, can you see me over this? I actually could share some of my own experience witnessing human rights violations in the Philippines. When I was a graduate student here, actually in Berkeley, just downstairs in the Department of Sociology, during the 1990s and 1997, I actually had an opportunity to go to Morag Valley, where I lived with victims of militarization under that regime, the Ramos regime, but who had been basically doubly victimized because they had already been displaced by the Marcos dictatorship several decades prior. I also had a chance to meet with victims in Lupao, who the family members of people who had been massacred by the Marcos regime. But I can share that later, because what I really want to talk about with you today is the Imperial University. So in recent years, scholars have actually really been writing a lot and critiquing the rise of what they're calling the Imperial University. That is, they're critiquing the fact that the university is increasingly a privatized university, that the university is an institution that is ever more in collusion with U.S. imperial aims, that this is an institution that draws from the technologies of empire to subject those of us who would challenge it with silencing and policing. Indeed, and I'm really fortunate to have that. One of the most vocal critics of the Imperial University has actually been one of my colleagues at UC Davis, Professor Sunaina Myra, whose latest co-edited book, and you all should get it, is actually titled Imperial University. So in the book, she starts off really talking about what's probably the most blatant instance or instantiation of the Imperial University in recent years, and that was the pepper spraying of students on my campus in the fall of 2011. Do people remember hearing about this a couple years ago, the pepper spraying of student activists who were part of the Occupy movement? If you heard about it, raise your hands. Great, and if you haven't, now you know, because this is a very important piece of kind of history in terms of thinking about what's happening on our campuses right now. And yet it's perhaps from the site of this campus where the beginnings of the Imperial University are to be found over a century ago. And it's been against the bodies of Filipinos, my people, for those of you Filipino, our people, that its technologies of silencing and policing in the service of imperialism were first crafted. The buildings of these hallowed halls, including this one, Barrows, bear the traces of our people's blood. These buildings bear the names of men who were crucial to the colonization and subjugation of the Philippines. If they earned the privilege of having buildings named after them for their achievements, their celebrated careers include having created and mastered the tools of imperial rule. Moses Hall, how many folks have had classes in Moses Hall? Raise your hands. You know you've been there before. Bernard Moses was a member of the U.S. Philippine Commission from 1900 to 1902 during the period of U.S. colonial rule. Kroeber. Folks have been to Kroeber? Anybody? Raise your hands. UC Berkeley anthropology professor Alfred L. Kroger publishes the Handbook of Peoples of the Philippines in 1919. Indeed, among the library and museum collections you all study there, with significant materials on the Philippines, are the David Barrows papers, the Kroger papers, the Jesuit papers in the United States and the Philippines, documents of American teachers who lived in the Philippines during the colonial period, like John Minier, Herbert Ingrid Priestley, Oliver George Walcott, James Hopper, reports of the United States Philippine Commission 1900, Thomas MacArthur Anderson's photographs of the Philippine resistance to U.S. colonial rule. There's many others. Ultimately, all of the knowledge that was produced by these great men was knowledge aimed at improving upon and perfecting modalities of colonial rule. And I want to reflect a little bit more on Barrows, David Barrows, after whom this particular building is named. David Barrows, after teaching history for 2 years in the State Normal School in San Diego, Barrows was appointed superintendent of schools for Manila in 1900 by William H. Taft, who was president of the Philippine Commission. Later, he became chief of the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes of the Islands, and for the next 2 years, he was largely engaged in reconnaissance of the little-known areas of the Philippines. In 1903, he was appointed General Superintendent of Education for the Philippines and completely reorganized the educational system. It was ultimately under his charge that the Thomasites, and for those of you who've studied Asian American Studies, Filipino American Studies, you should know the Thomasites were the American teachers who were recruited to do the work of Americanizing the Filipinos during U.S. colonial rule. They took up where the soldiers had left off. If the military had been successful in brutally eliminating Filipino resistance during the Filipino-American War, the Thomasites' mission was to work on capturing the hearts and minds of those who remained. Teachers became the new army of occupation. When Filipinos were later entrusted with control over education, this came after 1935, in some ways they were the first Filipino Americans for their collaboration with the colonial regime. In fact, and again, should be familiar for those of you who are Asian American Studies students or have taken Filipino American Studies. The very first Filipinos to come to the U.S., men that we often think of, as constituting that first wave of immigrants to the U.S. Those first immigrants were sponsored by the U.S. government to study in this country. They were specifically drawn from the ranks of the elite in the Philippines to assimilate Americanism more effectively here, so that when they went back home to the Philippines, they could most effectively secure American interests. It would be in the hands of Filipinos. And how successful they have been, as we've seen in today's presentations, because I think it's really important here to understand the extrajudicial killings, disappearances, arrest and detention and torture, all the forms of violence taking place in the Philippines, being done by the Philippine military and paramilitary against the Filipino people, done against Melissa, as we've heard, but also briefly discussed by Professor Barrios, done by the people, of course, that you work with, Pastor Jeanelle. All of this violence should be understood as ultimately about eliminating those who are standing up against U.S. imperialism today, as it is being supported and advanced by its Philippine agents. Like the pensionados before them, the Filipino economic and political elite today have been model students. So the question I have for you is, are we to be the modern day Thomasites or pensionados? Are we to be educators and students in service of empire? Fortunately, it's very possible to be of, but also against, the university. It was in response to the exploitation of Filipino farm workers into the 1960s and in the response to the invisibilization of the Philippines and the Filipino immigrant experience in American history books, Filipino students and other students of color engaged in the Third World Strike, which took place at San Francisco State University, but also really involved so many students from this campus. Many of the student activists engaged in mobilizing for the campus strike were also engaged in supporting the labor struggles of Filipino farm workers. The students, joined by their progressive faculty, campus workers, and the broader community, not only demanded more admission of people of color so we could be here, and you need to really understand that we are here because people fought out there. They demanded that we have more access to places like this, but they also fundamentally demanded a rethinking of the purpose of education. They demanded an education that would serve the people, to serve our people. In the early 2000s, it was also from this campus, not just literally in this building, that Filipino graduate students came together to form the Critical Filipino and Filipino Studies Collective in response to the global war on terror that had been declared by President George W. Bush in the wake of the 9/11 bombings in the World Trade Center. But we were especially concerned that the Philippines was supposed to be the new major front of this global war on terror. And we articulated our mission in this way. As an activist scholar group, the Critical Filipina and Filipino Studies Collective seeks to organize educators and scholars to interrogate and challenge histories of Western imperialism's ongoing neo-colonial relations in the Philippines and the relationship to past and present Filipina and Filipino migrations. We claim our roots in the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist struggles of the Filipina and Filipino people, from which a critical nationalist Philippine studies was born. And we also claim roots with the student movements of the 1960s in the US that gave rise to ethnic studies. We propose that the field of critical Filipino and Filipina studies focuses on the relationship between the history of empire and the Filipina and Filipino diaspora. That was our mission as it was articulated then. It's a mission as we see it now. So to the questions I asked, are we to be the modern day Thomasites or pensionados? Are we to be students and educators in service of empire? I say that it can and should be a resolute and resounding no. Let us take the lead of radical scholars from here to the Philippines who have applied themselves to the work of exposing and not colluding with empire. Let us take the lead of the likes of Pastor Jeanelle and witness to the violence of empire and use our positions, as she calls it, our institutional sway, our moral authority to speak truth to power. Let's take the lead of Melissa Roxas and the many young people, including many students, who yearly take the trek to the Philippines to link with and learn from marginalized communities, even at great risk to themselves, only to return here to testify not only to the violence of imperialism, but to testify to the beauty and power and absolute necessity of resistance.